Well, we're going to get the scene from the Middle East where I would say the Gaza ceasefire, the putative peace is in a certain amount of trouble, to say the least. They're talking about airstrikes happening again, and which has upset Hamas, and Israel yesterday pledged to cut off the electricity supply to Gaza. So all is not well in terms of the peace process there. Now, over there on the scene, or near enough anyway, in Israel, in Tel Aviv, is Talk's international editor, Isabel Oakeshott. So let's get the latest from her. Welcome to the show, Isabel.
Good evening, Kevin. And it's a pretty somber mood here, I would say. There's a general sense that this whole operation by the Israelis is just not really succeeding. One very well-placed follower of events here that I spoke to earlier went so far as to say we're not much further on than we were in October. Still said many hostages to be released. They think 24 that are still alive, and sadly many, about the same number again, of bodies to be returned, and no sign of that happening. And the mood is very much that Israel is going to have to go back in, and go back in hard. But nobody seems to know how this will end. You know, this is what's on everybody's minds here. Number one, get the hostages back. But the hostages are the only leverage that Hamas really has. What else have they actually got? So, you know, they are holding on to those hostages because once they're returned, then, well, what does Hamas really have to play for? After all, 80% of the Gaza Strip has basically been flattened.
And has Israel come through on its threat to cut electricity off from Gaza?
I believe so, but that doesn't mean that Gaza is in some kind of blackout, because there's only actually, as I understand it, one power line that has been operational since the October the 7th attacks, and that power line may have been cut off, but there are a lot of generators there, and I believe they've got enough for several weeks worth of power. The key concern is the impact of cutting that main power supply on the desalination plants, and whether that'll actually leave civilians in Gaza without clean water, with all the devastating kind of health implications that will have. I think that is considered a, you know, fairly significant threat to the civilians there.
And what's the mood in Israel? I believe that you know, support for Netanyahu, while still there, is not particularly enthusiastic and maybe fading. Then you've got Donald Trump, who's saying, you know, release the hostages or there will be hell to pay. As you say, the spectre of war re-emerging, rising again. The people of Israel must be fairly despondent, aren't they? And what's their mood?
Oh, yeah, I mean, they absolutely are. The mood is quite gloomy, I would say. There's in terms of Netanyahu, I mean, latest polling in Israel suggests 73% of people, nearly three-quarters of people, think Netanyahu should step down. You know, they've lost confidence really in this leader. However, there is a new military chief of staff who is considered to be a lot more sort of aggressive than the last one. So that's raised some hopes. People are not happy at all at the spectre of any significant figure from Trump's administration negotiating direct with Hamas. That's simply not the done thing in the US or in the UK. You don't negotiate with terrorists. It feels a bit like what we did, you know, after the Taliban came back in. You know, countries started like trying to talk to the Taliban. It really hasn't gone down well at all here. And I think in Washington tonight there's some backpedaling on that. I think that people are just getting a bit desperate. You know, the whole thing, it just dominates everything and everywhere you go. You know, every street has these pictures of the hostages, every building, every car, you know, with the yellow ribbons. It's everywhere, omnipresent. And, you know, until those hostages, the last one is out, this is very unfinished business. But Hamas is asking for the release of all Palestinian prisoners. I mean, how can that happen? Because then that creates a whole other national security threat.
So what we've got here really is sort of stalemate, haven't we? And the sort of build-up of the return to war. Is that the feeling that inevitably, fairly soon, the bombing's going to restart, the shooting's going to restart? Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And people are frustrated. You know, the Israelis kind of want it to start again because they think that that's the only way that we can actually move the situation forward. Not that anyone wants never-ending war, but you know, they feel that this stalemate, if that's what we could call it, isn't actually bringing the hostages home, which is their number one ask. As for what comes after that, you know, how, if the hostages are returned, how does any kind of governance get restored in Gaza? No one has an answer to that. You know, they just say it can't involve Hamas. It has to be some kind of what they call a technical government or technocrat government. So, you know, basically run by a bunch of officials. Who are those officials going to be, and how can it be certain that they're not linked to the wrong kind of people?
And has the sort of stylized release of these hostages over the past few weeks, of course, the most recent ones proving that too many of these hostages are no longer alive, so we've got the grim spectacle of coffins coming out, but and then the doubt as to who was in the damn things, which is even worse. Yeah. But has counterintuitively the process of releasing the hostages but not releasing all of them, if anything, made the tension, made the situation worse?
Well, I just think it's just all been so tremendously long drawn out, hasn't it? And people just feel that, you know, what has it all come down to? Of course, for those that have got their loved ones back, deeply traumatized though they must be, those that were lucky enough to get out alive, you know, it's obviously better than those who are still waiting. But some of the families who are most proactively campaigning for the return of other hostages are those who've already got their loved ones back, because they understand how awful it is and what those poor people in captivity are going through. So it's a pretty desperate situation still. And it just, the conversations that you have, even with people in the most expert position, don't seem to give any answers. You know, I've spoken to people today in very senior diplomatic positions here, and it's, you know, they talk about, well, it's all, you know, we've got to find a diplomatic solution. I suppose they would say that because they're diplomats. But what kind of diplomacy can you have with a terror organization whose mission is to actually destroy Israel?
Yeah, exactly right. It's a very difficult situation, to say the least, and it looks pretty grim. Looks like the war's going to start again, which is bad news. Talking of wars, we're going to go to break now, Isabel, but we're going to talk about that other war, the Ukraine war, and the talks going on as we speak, almost, in Saudi Arabia. Zelensky's arrived, the Americans are there, the Ukrainians are there. This is another chapter in Donald Trump's book of peace.